It was the year 1754. In North America, two powerful nations were standing face to face, Britain and France. Both dreamed of controlling more land and more trade, and both believed that whoever held North America would hold the future. The real tension centered around the Ohio River Valley. This land was fertile for farming, and the fur trade here was extremely profitable. The British wanted their settlers to move west and claim the region, while the French started building forts to protect it for themselves. A clash was almost certain. At this point, the governor of Virginia sent a 22-year-old officer named George Washington to deliver a warning: the French should leave, because this land belonged to Britain. But things didn't end with a simple warning. In the wilderness, Washington's small force clashed with French troops, and during the skirmish, a French officer named Jumonville was killed. That single event was the spark. The French were furious. They struck back, attacking British forts. What started as a local conflict over land quickly grew larger. By the end of 1754, the fight had a name: the French and Indian War, because Native American tribes also joined, some siding with the French and others with the British. This was no longer a small border fight. Within just a few years, it expanded into a global conflict that the world would remember as the 7 Years' War, shaping the future of empires on both sides of the Atlantic. In the mid-1700s, one region in North America became the center of tension: the Ohio River Valley. But why was this land so important that Britain, France, and Native American tribes all wanted control over it? First, the valley had fertile farmland. British settlers were pushing westward, searching for new land to grow crops. For them, the Ohio Valley was the perfect place to expand. Second, it was all about trade. At the time, the fur trade was one of the most profitable businesses. French traders were already working with Native Americans in the region, exchanging European goods for valuable animal furs. For France, the valley was not only about wealth but also about connecting their territories from Canada down the Mississippi River. And then came the Native Americans themselves. For them, this was home, their ancestral land. They hunted here, lived here, and traded here long before Europeans arrived. But as Britain and France both claimed the valley, tribes faced a difficult choice: who should they support? Some sided with the French, because French settlers were fewer in number and often built relationships through trade. Others leaned toward the British, attracted by their powerful weapons and abundant supplies. This made the Ohio Valley a crossroads of three powers with three different goals. Britain wanted farmland, France wanted empire and trade routes, and Native Americans wanted to protect their land and way of life. The clash of these interests turned the valley into a powder keg. Small skirmishes soon broke out, and these local struggles helped ignite the much larger conflict that we now know as the French and Indian War. In 1754, a 22-year-old officer from Virginia stepped onto the stage of history: George Washington. At this time, he wasn't a president, or even a famous leader. He was just a young soldier sent west to defend Britain's claim to the Ohio Valley. While moving through the wilderness, Washington's small force clashed with French troops. In the skirmish, a French officer named Jumonville was killed. That single event enraged the French, and Washington knew they would strike back. To prepare, he ordered his men to quickly build a small wooden fort. They called it Fort Necessity. But it was poorly built, rushed, and weak, hardly ready for a real battle. In July of 1754, the French returned with about 700 soldiers and native allies. Washington had fewer than 400 men. To make things worse, heavy rain poured down, soaking gunpowder and collapsing parts of the fort. The fight dragged on for hours, until Washington had no choice. Surrounded and exhausted, he agreed to surrender. It was his very first battle, and his very first defeat. But this loss gave Washington something more important than victory: experience. The young officer who surrendered at Fort Necessity would one day command an entire revolution and become the first president of the United States. The Battle of Fort Necessity also showed the world that the struggle in the Ohio Valley was no small border dispute. It was the beginning of the much larger conflict we now call the French and Indian War. When the French and Indian War broke out in 1754, it wasn't just Britain and France fighting for control of North America. The Native American tribes played a crucial role in deciding how the conflict unfolded. For the native peoples, the Ohio Valley and surrounding lands weren't just territory on a map. This was their home, their hunting ground, and the center of their way of life. But as the war began, tribes faced a difficult choice. Should they support the French, the British, or try to stay neutral? Many tribes, like the Huron, Algonquin, and Ottawa, sided with the French. Why? Because the French presence in North America was smaller. French settlers usually came as traders, not farmers. They built relationships through fur trading, exchanged gifts, and were less likely to take native lands for permanent settlement. To these tribes, the French felt more like allies than conquerors. On the other hand, tribes like the Iroquois Confederacy leaned toward the British. The Iroquois had long been rivals of the French and their native allies, and Britain offered them weapons, supplies, and the promise of trade advantages. Some smaller tribes also sided with the British, hoping that their growing power would protect them in the long run. But it wasn't always clear-cut. Some tribes switched sides during the war, depending on which European power seemed stronger at the moment. Others tried to remain neutral, wanting no part in a conflict between foreign nations. In the end, the Native Americans were not just bystanders. They were guides, warriors, and diplomats who influenced battles, shaped alliances, and kept both Britain and France on edge. Yet, tragically, after the war ended, neither empire truly honored the promises made to their native allies. The tribes had fought for survival, but the struggle for their land was far from over. The French and Indian War was filled with dramatic battles that shaped the future of North America. 3 of the most important were fought at Fort Duquesne, Fort William Henry, and Quebec. It began with Fort Duquesne, a powerful French stronghold at the forks of the Ohio River. For the British, capturing it meant controlling the gateway to the west. Early attempts failed. General Braddock's expedition in 1755 ended in disaster when French troops and their native allies ambushed the British. But years later, in 1758, the British returned with a much larger force. Outnumbered, the French abandoned and burned the fort, and the British rebuilt it as Fort Pitt, which would later grow into the city of Pittsburgh. Meanwhile, further north, the struggle for control of the frontier continued at Fort William Henry in 1757. The French, led by General Montcalm, laid siege to the British garrison. After days of bombardment, the British surrendered. But what followed was infamous. As the defeated soldiers and settlers marched out, chaos broke out among some native allies of the French. Many captives were attacked or killed in what became known as the Massacre at Fort William Henry. This event shocked the colonies and deepened the hatred between Britain and France. The decisive turning point came in 1759 at Quebec. The British, under General James Wolfe, faced the French commanded by Montcalm. Quebec was heavily fortified, and for weeks the British could not break through. Then Wolfe made a bold move, leading his troops up a hidden path to the Plains of Abraham. There, in a short but fierce battle, both Wolfe and Montcalm were mortally wounded. But the British claimed victory. The fall of Quebec meant that France could no longer defend Canada. Together, these battles showed the shifting tide of war. From the loss at Fort William Henry to the triumph at Quebec, Britain slowly gained the upper hand, setting the stage for final victory in the French and Indian War. By the mid-1750s, the French and Indian War was going badly for Britain. Early defeats at places like Fort Duquesne and Fort William Henry shook the colonies. Morale was low, money was short, and many wondered if France might actually win control of North America. Everything began to change in 1757, when a new leader rose in Britain, William Pitt the Elder. Pitt wasn't a general, he was a politician. But he had a bold vision and the determination to make Britain a global power. Pitt's strategy was simple but powerful. First, he decided that North America would be the main focus of the war. While other leaders worried about Europe, Pitt believed that if Britain could win in America, France would lose its empire. Second, he poured money into the colonies. He promised the American settlers that London would pay for supplies, equipment, and troops. This gave the colonists a real reason to fight and cooperate with the British Army. Third, Pitt brought in strong new commanders. Men like Geoffrey Amherst and James Wolfe replaced older, less effective generals. With fresh leadership and better planning, the British Army became far more organized. The results were dramatic. Under Pitt's strategy, the British captured key French forts and won important victories, including the turning point at Quebec in 1759. France, once dominant in the Ohio Valley and Canada, was suddenly on the defensive. William Pitt never fought on the battlefield, but his vision changed the course of the war. By focusing resources, rallying the colonies, and appointing effective leaders, he turned Britain's early defeats into lasting victories. When the war finally ended, Britain stood as the most powerful empire in North America, thanks in large part to the strategy of William Pitt. By 1759, the French and Indian War had raged for years, but neither side had fully broken the other. That changed with one dramatic battle, the Battle of Quebec, a true turning point in the war. Quebec was the heart of French Canada, sitting high above the St. Lawrence River. If the British could take it, France's control in North America would collapse. But the city seemed impossible to capture. The cliffs were steep, the French defenses were strong, and their commander, General Louis-Joseph de Montcalm, was experienced and confident. On the British side stood General James Wolfe, a young and daring leader chosen by William Pitt. Wolfe knew he couldn't win with a direct assault. For months, his troops bombarded the city, but Quebec still held. Then Wolfe made a bold and risky plan. On the night of September 12, 1759, British soldiers silently climbed a narrow, hidden path up the cliffs west of Quebec. By morning, Wolfe's army stood on the Plains of Abraham, ready for battle on open ground. Montcalm rushed out to meet them. The fight was short but fierce. Musket volleys roared across the plain. In the chaos, both commanders were struck down, Wolfe fatally wounded but learning just before his death that his army had won, and Montcalm mortally injured, carried back into Quebec. Within days, the city surrendered. The fall of Quebec was a devastating blow to France. Without it, they could no longer defend Canada, and the balance of the war shifted permanently in Britain's favor. The Battle of Quebec became legendary not just for its military impact, but for the sacrifice of two generals whose deaths symbolized the high cost of empire. It was the moment that sealed Britain's path to victory in the French and Indian War. By the early 1760s, the French and Indian War had dragged on for nearly a decade. After the British victory at Quebec in 1759 and the capture of Montreal in 1760, France's hold on North America collapsed. The war spread to Europe, the Caribbean, and even India, becoming part of what we now call the 7 Years' War. But by 1763, everyone was exhausted and ready for peace. That peace came with the Treaty of Paris, signed in February 1763. The treaty completely reshaped the map of North America. Britain emerged as the clear winner. France agreed to give up almost all of its territory on the continent. Britain gained Canada from France and also secured all French lands east of the Mississippi River, except for New Orleans. In addition, Spain, which had entered the war on France's side, gave Florida to Britain. With these gains, Britain now controlled the most powerful empire in North America. France, on the other hand, lost nearly everything. To compensate its ally Spain, France handed over Louisiana west of the Mississippi River, including New Orleans. France was left with only a few small Caribbean islands and fishing rights off Newfoundland. Spain, while losing Florida to Britain, gained the vast Louisiana territory from France. In the end, Spain traded one colony for another, but France's power in North America was gone. The Treaty of Paris ended nearly a century of rivalry between Britain and France on the continent. But it also created new tensions. For Britain, victory came with huge war debts, and soon they would try to recover money by taxing their American colonies. For the colonists, this was the beginning of new frustrations that would eventually lead to the American Revolution. The Treaty of Paris in 1763 made Britain the undisputed winner of the French and Indian War. The British Empire now stretched across Canada, the Ohio Valley, and Florida. On the map, It looked like total victory. But behind the celebrations was a serious problem: money. The war had been incredibly expensive. Britain had borrowed huge sums to pay for soldiers, supplies, and fleets across the globe. By the end, the empire was buried under massive debt. Victory came with a heavy price tag. So the question in London was simple: who should pay for it? British leaders looked across the Atlantic at the American colonies. From their point of view, the war had been fought to protect the colonists from the French and Native Americans. Shouldn't the colonists help cover the cost? That's when Britain began introducing a series of new taxes and laws: the Sugar Act, the Stamp Act, and later the Townshend Acts. These taxes weren't just about raising money, they were also a way for Britain to tighten control over the colonies. But in America, the reaction was explosive. Colonists argued that they had already sacrificed lives and resources in the war. They believed that being taxed without any representation in the British Parliament was unfair. This anger gave birth to a powerful slogan: no taxation without representation. So while Britain gained land and power, the war also created a new divide between the empire and its colonies. The debt from the French and Indian War pushed Britain to tax the colonists, and those taxes planted the first seeds of protest that would eventually grow into the American Revolution. When the French and Indian War ended in 1763, Britain stood at the height of its power. It had defeated France, gained vast new territories, and claimed dominance in North America. But hidden beneath this victory was a new conflict, not with France, but with Britain's own colonies. The problem started with money. The war had left Britain with crushing debt. To pay it off, Parliament decided the American colonies should help shoulder the costs. After all, the war had been fought to protect them. So Britain passed new laws: the Sugar Act, the Stamp Act, and later more taxes on imports. But the colonists didn't see it that way. They argued that they had already shed blood in the war and contributed in their own ways. What angered them most was the principle: they had no representatives in the British Parliament, yet they were being taxed. That felt like tyranny. Out of this frustration came the famous cry: no taxation without representation. The war also changed the map. By removing the French threat from Canada and the Ohio Valley, Britain unintentionally made the colonies feel more secure and independent. Before, they had needed British protection against France. Now, with France gone, many colonists began to wonder, why do we need Britain at all? In short, the French and Indian War did more than redraw borders. It changed the relationship between Britain and its colonies. Victory created debts, debts led to taxes, and taxes sparked resentment. That resentment grew into protests, boycotts, and eventually revolution. So while the Treaty of Paris ended one war, it quietly planted the seeds of another, the American Revolution, just a decade later.